Welcome to the latest episode of Leadership and Health Culture in Healthcare. We're in Series 8, not even onto it. We're in Series 8, and we're focusing on people that have made a huge and fundamental change through campaigning nearly always, sadly, as a result of tragedy. And we're talking about how that's come about and what does it mean for us in healthcare, in leadership and culture. And I'm delighted to have Melissa Mead. Melissa, welcome to the podcast. Rather than me try and summarize you and your experience, let's let people understand a little bit about you and the family, and also how you've come about to being so involved in healthcare and campaigning for change.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be able to share my story and obviously, as you mentioned there, talk about my son William, who sadly died in 2014. A sort of a little bit of background. I was never involved in healthcare apart from visiting it on a personal basis. But my son was a healthy child. He wasn't a sickly baby at all, had no reason to really visit the doctors or anything. And when he started nursery, he developed a cough. And over a period of about 6 or 7 weeks, we went backwards and forwards about the cough that was worsening. And it culminated in a few days before his death. He was really quite poorly. And we visited the doctor. We called the out of hours. We did lots and lots of things. And ultimately, what happened was the sepsis that he had developed wasn't recognised. There were fundamental errors in his last visit to the doctor 36 hours before he died. Some key observations weren't taken. And as parents, we weren't really listened to. And ultimately, we took William home, and I found him passed away when I went in and checked on him when he was asleep. And, at this stage, he was only 17 days past his first birthday. So he was, in essence, non-verbal. I mean, he could say mum and dad and car, but he couldn't say, mummy, this hurts here, or this is how I'm feeling, or I'm feeling worse. And I think even, like my 9-year-old son, Arthur, can't explain pins and needles. So, when do we begin to be able to explain how we're feeling? I don't know what that age is, but certainly William wasn't able to vocalize how he was feeling. And I suppose once he died, it just became very obvious very quickly that it became a them and us process, because I understood when I had the call with the coroner that he had died of sepsis, of course, and that he had had an underlying pneumonia, for which was obviously undiagnosed. And it just got my brain whirring. And I thought, he could be alive, I think, if I had been listened to, or more purposeful observations or tests being done. And I needed to really become an expert in what was right in William's presentation, in his care. And I suppose that started me on this journey of understanding. So I had to become an expert. I had to ask probing questions. Unfortunately, what I was met with was no less a word of wall, to be honest. My emails were not responded to, my calls were not returned. And people I find in my position have no choice but to sort of turn to litigation. And that isn't something that we wanted, because I just wanted to grieve. I wanted to curl up in a ball like every human. And I wasn't able to do that. And I had to sort of wear these two hats. I had, when we had his new reporting or we had the post-mortem back, I would take to my bed for a few days. I would cry. I would think about all that I had lost. And then I had to put my objective hat on and say, right, okay, this shouldn't have happened. What can we do to stop it happening again? And I suppose the real kickstart of it was when William's final NHS England report was published, which is a root cause analysis report. It found 16 failings in his care and 4 missed opportunities to save his life. And the inquest found that he could have and should have been saved with better care. Following that, this report was published, and I then did a huge amount of media, television and radio, And it was picked up by the then Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who apologised to us in Parliament for allowing William's death, and he apologised on behalf of the NHS and the government. And I quite simply, I tweeted him and I said, Jeremy, how about you apologise to my face? And I did. And he met me and he apologised. And I said, Jeremy, the best apology is change behaviour. And from that moment on, I soon joined the UK Sepsis Trust charity, and we worked together as multi-organisations, as stakeholders, to improve patient care with the same shared objectives. And I find that very, from a personal level, I find that very cathartic, because I still am William's mum, and this is my way of being his mum somehow, I suppose. And I think if we can improve care for the Williams of tomorrow, then I've done my bit, and William's life or his death would not have been in vain. So that's a very short synopsis of summary of sort of where I am now. Obviously, lots have changed in the last 14 years, 12 years, beg your pardon. And I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm slightly lost for words, which is unusual for me, Melissa. But from such tragedy, and then the campaigning that you have done and the work of the UK Sepsis Trust and others is just unbelievably brilliant. And I have so many questions. Let me drill into some then, if I can. And you talked about at the beginning there, this kind of culture. So let's start with the cultural aspects. You weren't listened to as parents, and then you went into then the second area, which was you just hit brick walls. And I imagine, although you can tell me differently, people probably thought you were a nuisance. You were probing too much. You were, and so let's start with not being listened to, because that's come up with other tragedies like Martha's Law, with children not being listened to in hospital and parents saying, no, this is wrong. What, just from a cultural aspect, when you have looked at this, what do you think is happening that parents aren't taken seriously?
I think it's probably quite a multifactorial, few prongs to that. Certainly in our situation at the time, I am a lay person, I am non-clinical, but I was simply saying he's just not right, and I don't know why, but he's just not right. And I was told on multiple occasions, you're a first-time mum, you're bound to be worried, we're going into flu season, it's just viral. I'm sure things that are definitely not going to be new to your listeners. And I don't know whether, reflecting back on it now, whether it was, I mean, we know that, a huge proportion of the children that go into primary care are not critically unwell. So is it this ignorance to thinking, well, it's not going to happen to me, this isn't going to be the critically ill child? Is it poor training so that they can't recognise, certainly sepsis? Or is it purely that we saw the GP at 5:40 on a Friday afternoon heading into winter when the hospital was on black alert, shut because they were full? Did that play a part into it? Was the doctor sort of overworked? Was he under pressure not to prescribe antibiotics? There are so many things involved. And, as a family, when we bring our children or indeed our loved ones to healthcare, this is a whole brand new thing for us. But what we don't know is what's going on in that healthcare professional's life beyond the wall of work. Are they going through a breakup? Have they had a loved one die recently? Are they under pressure at work? And we all have bad days. We all bring that to work in some form or another. And so it's very difficult to pin it down on one thing, but I think there are so many things that contribute to it. But not being listened to, I feel, is quite fundamental, because being a healthcare professional in whichever form that is, right up to your consultant, down to your healthcare assistant, or even a carer in the community who are not often given the respect that they deserve, is that I'm coming to you because I'm concerned and I don't have the answers, and you are in a position of privilege. You are a doctor, you are a nurse, you are whoever you are, and you're there to support and help me.
Yeah.
I don't know at what point that became so broken down that we don't treat each other as we want to be treated ourselves. At what point do we think, actually, this isn't an hysterical mum, or even if I am an hysterical mum, why won't you listen to me? It shouldn't just be those people that are tenacious, that push back, that are articulate, that are given the same amount of sort of credence that other people are given, you know?
Yes, and I recognize lots of that because I often in the organization I lead, when things go wrong, I think you've just described kind of human factor elements, systemic factor elements, and it's really important to unpack all that because people don't come and do things wrong. Circumstances come together to make things go wrong, and it's about saying, actually, have we systemically set things up sometimes to actually give us more a worse opportunity to make good decisions? And that's kind of stuff that you're unpacking there. The other cultural aspect is the response. You said you came up against barriers and brick walls. And can you think back to that time? What were you actually wanting to get out of understanding what had gone wrong? Because the reason I ask that is because I think healthcare organizations often don't understand what people want. They don't listen to them to say, well, how can we help you resolve this? And we go into defensive mode often. And so you you talked about a brick wall. What were you seeking at that point?
I think I very quickly realized that it was me sitting on a sofa with Dr. Google, and it was a machine that I came up against, and that is the only way I can explain it. The scales were so tipped in the favor of NHS, well, of litigation and whoever it
Yeah.
might have been. And I started off with a disadvantage. And I just kind of feel as though we are not given the opportunity to sit down and have an adult conversation, because that's all I wanted to do. I wanted to sit down with those people that were involved and say, what happened? What
Yeah.
went wrong? And the issue is that the NHS to us lay people is the NHS. It's one big thing. You're all
Yeah.
joined up. But actually, when you start digging underneath,
We're
it's so
not. Yeah.
well, you aren't.
Yeah.
It's totally siloed. You know,
Yeah.
I had no idea that the GP that saw William on the Friday was a different organization to who saw him on the Saturday. The Saturday organization couldn't access the notes of the Friday. There were so many things that were disjointed, and I only started to really understand that after his death. I think communication is really key here, and also giving us lay people responsibility back as well, to be able to speak up, to be able to advocate for ourselves. But yeah, it was really challenging, and I think there was the people that were individually involved, so the doctors that treated William, um, were not able to do what they wanted to do. They were governed by, you must do this, you must do that, you mustn't say this, you mustn't say that, for fear of, well, I suppose the litigation. And we'll never learn anything from that if we're governed by fear.
Um,
Um,
And Melissa, I guess because you were, I think, going, the complaint was against probably three different areas. It was the primary care, the 111 service, and the out of hours GPs. Is that
yeah.
why NHS England were leading that because they had to kind of sit over all of that to make sure
Yeah.
it got to some kind of connected response.
So yeah, I mean, I very quickly understood that you had to make a complaint to the organisation that you had an issue with, which for us was 3 different organisations and the ambulance service. I then very quickly understood that I got these reports back that I hadn't been involved in. No one had come and sat down and talked to me, or my husband William's dad. And these reports said nothing could have been done differently. And I was reading these reports thinking that didn't happen. That isn't how that played out. That isn't what I said. I would never have used that word. And I
Yeah.
thought, who's marked this homework? And it very quickly dawned on me that organisations are essentially investigating themselves, which in a world where we want these things to go away, I mean, earlier you said about being a nuisance. I was called a constructive nuisance at one
Nice
point.
phrase to be given
Yeah,
someone who's...
the person that actually called me a constructive nuisance said it's actually a compliment because what you've achieved is pretty good. But what I quickly understood was that there was no joined upness of the organisations. So at the time we were governed by the CCGs rather than ICBs. And so I became a thorn in the side of the CCG. And I just kept saying, I'm not happy with this. This is not acceptable. Where have you done your due diligence about these independent experts? They're not really independent, are they? Because they live 20 miles from your office. All of these things. And then it was NHS England South that picked it up, and after the inquest. And it just kind of got to a point where, you know, we had the inquest, the findings were that he could have and should have been saved. And then going back through the investigation process, you know, and his final report was quite a lot of pages long, but it started off very few pages because it was like, well, we couldn't have done this and we couldn't have done that. And I said, but that's not true. And it ended up coming back to me, and I was proofreading it and having to send it back in. And we ended up with a gold standard report that had all of these findings. And at the end of it, I was so emotionally hungover. It was unreal. And I didn't want any of that. And after we concluded all of those in meetings and different things, and the organisations had formally apologised, as they, you know, duty of candour tells them they should do. But I wanted to sit down with, in particular, the GP that sent William home on that Friday, who did make human errors, as well as the systemic ones that fed into his own personal circumstances. To be able to ask him, what happened? Like, forget all of that stuff. What happened?
Yeah.
And I think the first thing he said to me was, the first thing I think of when I wake up in the morning is William. And the last thing I think of when I go to bed at night is William. And I said, good, because that's going to inform your practice moving forwards every single day. You're never, ever going to make those same mistakes again. He's going to inform certainly his ability to break down those barriers of being a compassionate and kind doctor. But that's what I wanted in the beginning. Not everyone wants that, of course. I can't speak for everyone. But if we had a culture where we could sit down and arbitration or mediation, rather than get to this very adversarial situation that we ended up in, I think there would be so many lives saved, emotions saved, years of lives saved. Not, I mean, the money comes second, doesn't it? But I didn't, for those 3 years, I couldn't really grieve that my son. I couldn't sit down and, you know, wallow. And I wanted to wallow a little bit, you know. Yeah, that was robbed of me.
Yeah. So it does sound like there's a complete misbalance or just a poor design even in that process, because it has to be a process because you have to do it thoroughly, of then saying the first thing we should always do is ask the person what's important for you to find out, and go back to your point to sit down and let's talk about it, because all the other stuff is incidental. If there has to be redress professionally, organizationally, that can follow, but the first thing is what's important to you. And it sounds like in this respect that never happened until much later.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, we mustn't ignore the advent of PSurf, which has done wonders,
Yeah,
especially in acute organisations, at involving loved ones when harm has been
yeah,
caused or when
yeah,
things go wrong.
yeah,
But there is that missing in the community. We didn't make it to hospital because William died at home, and we are sort of cast adrift when something goes wrong. No one's there to say, this is what you need to do, this is who you need to contact. It was no short of just having, I just had to Google what I had to do, and I had no choice. No one was there to guide me through that. There
mm,
was no specific charity that is there. You're lucky if you get some leaflets given to you when the ambulance service have taken you to the hospital with your child. There's it's so disjointed, um especially in the community, and I find that really challenging.
yeah, yeah. Well, listen, what then made you do the next thing? Because you just said you were exhausted. You wanted to grieve. You didn't want 3 years of frankly bureaucratic nonsense spinning round in circles. You wanted, as you say, you just wanted to grieve and find a way of living with that loss. I'm interested in what then was different about you that you went, no, this is something I need to do something about, and hence Secretary of State and the sepsis. What was it that galvanized you to do that? Because not everybody would go down that route, would they? They'd
um
stop.
in short, that's a very easy question to answer, and that is William.
Yeah.
um you, very candidly, after William died, I was very unwell for a long period of time, with my mental health. And one day I sat there, and just in my head, I felt like I heard someone say, "It's okay, mummy, it's okay. And it's okay to carry on. It's okay to put one foot in front of the other. You don't have to let this sort of swallow you up. His death will not define you. His life defines who you are." And it occurred to me at that moment, and I don't know what sort of moment that was, that I am still William's mum. I am not going to be beholden to what happened to him. I will live on, and I will continue to be his mum somehow. And with deaths of elderly patients, or even my father died in 21. I'm able to talk to people about his life, his friendships, his work, all these things. Whereas when you have a very young child that's died, I can't say, "Oh, could you remember when William did this?" Or bump into someone that knew him, because quite frankly, he hadn't had a chance to live yet. And so by sharing his death, I get to share his life. And I suppose at that point, I thought, I still need to be his mum, and this is my way of being his mum. And, obviously that's underpinned by the fact that if this can happen to us, it can happen to anyone. And I simply didn't want that to happen. And this needed to be about learning, development, compassion, kindness, not about blame, not about revenge, not about anger. Um, yeah, I think that's probably why.
You were then cast into a world you had not existed in before. You've just always mentioned, just I was with the Secretary of State, and basically asked him to make a difference, because saying sorry is fine, but saying sorry and we'll do something about it is the outcome you were wanting. You were into campaigns. You now speak at huge events and are hugely influential in because of this because of William. um Tell us kind of what it's taken to kind of be involved in all of that, and what it takes to kind of do that campaigning with UK Sepsis as well.
When I first joined the charity was very small. It was in its infancy, but of course they already had a huge respect in the clinical space. But William's story really did thrust sepsis into the spotlight, especially in sort of 2014, 2000, those years following. And when I first met, say, for example, Jeremy Hunt or whoever, I worked with a number of key stakeholders. I sat across the table from them as an equal, because it doesn't matter who you are, what name you have, what letters you have after your name, whatever it might be, however much money you've got, we are all the same when it comes to sepsis, because it is indiscriminate. And I can vividly remember myself and Dr. Ron Daniels, who's the Chief Medical Officer of the Sepsis Trust, sitting across from Jeremy Hunt. And I said to him, Jeremy, if your children were poorly, what would you do? If would you know what sepsis was? Would you know how to act? He said, I don't think I would. And I said, that's where the problem is. You are no different from me. When you're at home in your slacks, having had dinner, your children are poorly, what are you going to do if you start to notice that they're unwell? We need to do this together. We need to have the same shared objective. And I have always gone about every campaign that I do, or even just my day job, working with hospitals and healthcare organizations to improve, is to always be a critical friend. I am not here to penalize. I am not here to put people down. I am here to help people be the better versions of themselves, to improve safety, to improve their care that they give, to have the quick wins, if you like, but also to ensure that other people don't have to endure what we have had to endure, because it shouldn't be. Certainly in the UK with the NHS, we shouldn't have people dying, and they don't need to die.
And in that role, and in you just mentioned some of the interactions that you have gone through, and you will see a lot of the NHS from different angles. What's your observation about the leadership and the culture then that you see that either helps people to get to this core answer of taking things seriously, taking sepsis, taking those standards, being compassionate, or not, or still being poorly operated, poorly led? What's your observations about that leadership and culture that you could share without naming places, etc.?
No, but yeah, the thing is I work with people that accept patients at the front door, right up to the CEO of the organization. In organizations where things don't work so well, it tends to be fed by money, chasing control totals, getting the deficit down. There's never going to be learning when the leadership team are not leading by example. That command and control leadership there's just no place for that. Leaders need to be visible, they need to be approachable, they need to be supportive rather than punitive, focused on listening and learning. Do they really listen, or is it just lip service? So it's really about understanding what your patients are telling you, what you can do to be better. And again, you're not having that punitive approach. People shouldn't feel like they can't speak up because they're not going to be listened to because there's some awful hierarchy. It shouldn't be like that. And we do know, there is an elephant in the room. There is a hierarchy in the NHS, certainly when it comes to healthcare professionals. And it just shouldn't be, because often the people that spend the most time with the patients are the people that are less paid, that work the hardest, and they are given the least recognition. And I think that's really sad, because they are so far removed from that leadership team. Do they ever see them? Do they ever communicate with them? Are they ever recognized? Are they, is their well-being ever thought about? Is there any recognition or appreciation, formally or informally, that build morale, and those sort of reinforcing those positive behaviors? Feeling valued is something that goes a really, really long way in any healthcare setting. I see, and I see the individuals that feel really valued have a proactivity to doing better. And also it's that culture of change. I mean, as English people, we don't like change, not particularly. It's not something that we're used to. However, accepting change, taking it on the chin, not as a criticism, but a better way forward, is really key. I think being able to listen, taking points on, or taking that change on, and seeing how you can improve, is only going to make you a better person, because if not, you just get stuck behind.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, isn't it, when listening to you talk then, because we can be technical, we can be, people need to know about sepsis. We can go down a training and education route. We can go down have you got the technical knowledge? Are we getting this diffused? Can everybody prove that they have got sepsis posters up, that they're trained, and etc.? But what you've just delved into, which is absolutely chimes with my experience, is actually people won't make the right decisions if they're not supported well, they've not got a great culture around them, and they are supported to do a great job. Then they are far more likely to be able to then go, actually, I need to listen to that mother because that might be something worrying. That really is the heart of it, isn't it?
It's and it's this whole being distracted. And if I turn up to A&E, we know that A&E is a fast-paced environment. It's often overflowing. It's noisy. There's lots going on. There's lots to remember. And of course, I'm obviously going to be a great advocate for, the modern service framework that's coming up for sepsis, with training, with better standards, continuity of care, etc. But if that receiving healthcare assistant that is doing your triage doesn't feel valued, is doing a second shift in a short amount of time, hasn't had a break, doesn't feel respected, has just had a breakup at home, whatever it might be, because, they are human, are they going to be on the ball? Are they going to be giving you your undivided attention? And when that person does make a mistake, is that their fault, or is it the culture in which they work? And I always sort of explain this in the sense that if you work for a big logistics organization, let's just pick, I don't know, DPD, and you drive a van and the brakes are broken on the van, and then you run someone over, is that your fault, or is it DPD's fault for not sorting the brakes out?
Not maintaining.
So whose error was it? And I think we have to be really realistic in organizational structure. When things go wrong in healthcare, humans come to harm. Those things can generally not be undone. William is not alive, and he never will be. That mistake cannot be undone. What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? If I was to just get really angry and really revengeful, or whatever it might be, that one won't be conducive to me healing. But it also doesn't recognize William's loss in a respectful way. And I think being able to work with organizations who are not governed by fear will produce better learning. And if you can imagine that we could put the money that was spent on William's litigation into change in that particular GP surgery, or, the ambulance service, whatever it might be, that money would make a huge difference, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I would rather that money have been spent there.
And Melissa, when you talk to national leaders, as you do, when you talk to politicians, when you're in those influential spaces, and I am sure you're talking about this area, which is great to have the technicalities, folks, great to have it focused, great to have national frameworks, great to have all this as really important around sepsis. But at the heart of it, of great care is a good culture, it's well supported staff. What reactions are you getting? Because one, the technical aspects are easier to implement, the cultural aspects and the leadership and getting great care being underpinned by great support for staff is just so much harder and frankly more essential in my book. What's the reaction when you talk about those things?
It can be a mixed bag, really. People tend to not want to do anything radical because of the fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
Policies, processes, behaviors, they all need to align with whatever values that organization has. However, if there's a gap, it's saying, oh, we put people first, but then actually they reward only targets, culture starts to deteriorate very quickly. People need to think outside the box. People really need to put the patient at the center of everything they do. And that can be quite challenging. And it does mean change, and it might be uncomfortable. But I always take this back to, if I sit in any room with any person, whoever they are, at some point in their life, they will be a patient. Would they want to be a patient at the hospital in which they manage? Would they feel safe? Would they feel, looked after? Would they feel like they've been given the time? And often than not, the responses I get is no. And I say, well, there's your answer.
And it's fascinating. We're very different experiences, but I'm 100% in agreement with you. I started these podcasts, and my absolute annoyance that we don't take the outcomes and the detail in the NHS staff survey correctly. And one of the key questions in the NHS staff survey is, would I want the care and treatment? I think I'm not going to get the question right, but it's something like, would I recommend where this organization to get care and treatment for myself or my family? And that is just such a killer question, because if the answer is poor on that, you've got a problem on every single ground.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it goes back to not listening again, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not listening to your staff and not listening to your patients. This would not be allowed in any other organization. If I get 3 different quotes for a roofing company to put a new roof on, they do a bad job, I would hold them to account. I would, but what are we doing in the NHS where we're allowing systems to fail? Yeah. And it shouldn't all be about money, but the problem is we're governed by it often than not.
Melissa, I could talk to you for hours, and that's not very helpful. And it's not helpful for a podcast episode. But before we finish, I'm sitting here listening and reflecting on what you're talking about, and you are quite remarkable in that something quite amazing in terms of a campaign around sepsis and taking William's tragic early death to become something helpful. But at the heart of that, and you've talked about this, is I'm not hearing lots of blame, but I do hear you talk a lot about people need to be accountable for what they've done, but not in a punitive sense. So how have you kind of got to a resolution that allows you to campaign, but know actually that it's okay to move on, even though something terrible and actually avoidable has happened to you and your family and impacted on William, causing him to die? How do you get that balance?
I don't know. I guess like I said to you before, when we lost William, I didn't just stop being his mum.
Yeah.
And, I don't get those kind of opportunities that other people will get. He would be, crikey, he'd be 13 this year. I don't know whether he'd like rugby, football, boys or girls. I never heard him got to say, I love you, mum.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything worse than losing a child. I certainly hope not. And I just have this burning desire to ensure that other families don't have to go through this. And I just want to help people to see that they don't have to carry on treating people in the way that they do. Culture shouldn't be treated as a side project. It should just be embedded into everything, rather than it just becoming, this is how things are done around here. That willingness to be able to adapt, sustained leadership. We see such a high turnover of staff and in the leadership space as well. And everyone needs to come in and make their own mark and do things their own way. But when do they sit down and say, what's it really like on the shop floor? Tell me what's happening. What can I do to best serve you? What can I do to serve you?
Yeah.
And that is what our leaders should be saying to our staff. And that is what our staff should be saying to our patients. How best can I serve you?
Yeah. And to finish off there, Melissa, looking forward, what's your hopes? What are you excited about in terms of the campaign and the difference it can make, just to give people a kind of view of that and get them focused on the really important things? Is, do we understand, your question to Jeremy Hunt, do you know anything about sepsis in case it impacts on you or your family? So what are you looking forward to? What are you optimistic about?
I'm definitely optimistic about the modern service framework for sepsis that has been agreed by the government, but what that will look like is, round the corner. And I cannot understate that the work that the charity, the UK Sepsis Trust, has done. We are a small team, but we are an impactful team, and we have a seat at that table, which has sort of gone full circle, because a decade ago we were fighting to get a seat at the table, and now we've got a seat at the table because they understand that we are a respected organisation in that space. I'm very excited about that, because that will bring those measures that people can use across all organisations. But again, you can change systems and processes, but you cannot change people. But I would hope that with the advent of the modern service framework, that it will give people the opportunity to embed change, to learn with that. So that's what I'm excited about. Excited about the modern service framework. I'm excited to see, hopefully, a reduction in mortality, less people becoming more unwell with sepsis. Not just focusing on the acute sector, but in those community settings in primary care as well, and a greater acknowledgement for the public as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Melissa, we've covered quite a lot of territory. You've mapped out and you talked about, the tragedy of William's death in 2014, just over one, and all the events that went on that meant that he died when he didn't need to, the battle with understanding what went wrong, and your insistence and a campaign to really get to the truth, and that challenge that culminated in what the coroner said and what the root cause analysis is, and then going into your campaign and work with UK Sepsis Trust to really make change. We talked about, at the heart of this, and I've echoes the things I say to staff during induction. We can be technically fabulous, but actually we need to be humanely brilliant and have a great culture at work to be able to make this a reality. And then you've also then talked about what the impact of the campaign does, and the future is very much focused around getting the modern service framework published, but also making the human change and the dynamics to reduce mortality. I'm sitting here challenging myself, thinking I lead a community organisation that covers half the region, and do we take sepsis really seriously, and can we spot it in our older population, our children, and do that work right? So I know I will take away, go and ask the team and talk to the team and understand from their perspective what's going on. Melissa, I'm in awe of what you've done. I can't quite even begin to comprehend what such brilliant outcomes have been achieved from such a terrible starting point with William's death. And you've talked just so wonderfully all the way through about being motivated to make sure it never happens to other people. And I have to say, from a healthcare perspective, we should just be thanking you so much for challenging us to be better out of your great adversary.
Thank you. No, I appreciate those those kind words. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. We're all equals in this. And as much as I can listen to you, you can listen to me, and we can work together. And that should be everyone's adage. And what I would like to end with is just say, just listen, just be kind, just be human, and just remember how you want to be treated.
Yeah. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me on Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. It's been a real honour to have you on and to share yours and William's story. And let's hope just the start of making the campaign on sepsis and reductions in mortality a reality. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.